Hello, my name is Χάρη Πίσχο. I'm a psychologist and founder of PsychologyNow.gr, the scientific website of psychology and mental health in Greece. I'm very excited to have here with me today Dr. Gabor Mate for a discussion about his book, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, which is recently published in the Greek language under the Greek title «Όταν το σώμα λέει όχι, το κόστος του κρυφού stress» from Key Books Publications. Dr. Mate is a renowned speaker and best-selling author, highly sought after his expertise on a range of topics including addiction, stress, and childhood development. He has written several best-selling books, including the book When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, which we are going to discuss about today. Dr. Mate, hello and welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
It is an honor and pleasure to have you here today with us to discuss the important subjects that you describe on your book about the connection between mental health and physical illness. So, your book, it is already a bestseller here in Greece.
Is it?
Yes. And probes the hidden connections between mental health and physical illness. We know that modern medical science often tries to reassure us that our minds and body are totally separate, when in reality they are deeply interconnected. In the book, you write about how mental stress often plays out in the body as unphysiological diseases, disorders, and chronic conditions that endanger our health and well-being, some issues that we will discuss later. Firstly, I would like to ask you what prompted you to write this book?
Well, I was in family practice and I was looking after newborn babies and old people and every stage of life. And I got to know families and I got to know multi-generational family histories. And I got to know individuals. And after a while, I began to notice that who got sick and who didn't get sick wasn't accidental. That there were certain emotional patterns and life histories in these individuals and in these families that I kept noticing. And what I didn't know at the time, because nobody in medical school teaches you this, is that the people's emotional lives were completely connected to their physiology. I couldn't help noticing certain emotional patterns. And then I began to do the research. And you know what I found? When the body says no, I actually quote Socrates. Now, Socrates lived about 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago. And he said in his time that the problem with doctors of today is that they separate the mind from the body. And this is still going on. And what I realized is that not only was there my own observations, there was a whole vast body of scientific research that shows the unity of mind and body, but that nobody was talking about this, or very few people. And that's why I wrote the book. I said I have to bring this to people's attention. The history of medicine from Socratic times to Roman times, there were individual physicians who made important observations about the unity of mind and body, including in the 19th century. Famous physicians connected multiple sclerosis to stress, breast cancer to stress, rheumatoid arthritis to stress.
In your book, you write in depth about the negative effect of stress on our body, associating with the development of physical illness.
Yes.
Can you briefly explain this correlation?
Sure. So stress is a normal response to a threat. If I were to threaten you right now, you'd have a stress response. That means that the emotional centers in your brain, the fear centers and the anger centers, would send messages to a part of your brain called the hypothalamus, which would send messages to the pituitary gland at the base of your skull, which would send messages to the adrenal gland on top of your kidneys. And your kidneys would then release stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. These stress hormones would help you fight back or to escape. So in the short term, the stress response is life-saving. But then there was a very famous Canadian or Hungarian-born Canadian physician. His name was Dr. János Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, who came to Canada, and in the laboratory, he stressed animals. And he found out that chronic stress reduces the immune system, makes the adrenal gland too big, and ulcerates the intestines. So he showed that acute stress is necessary for survival, but long-term stress harms health and the body. So the same hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that in the short term give you energy and help you fight or to escape, in the long term, thin your bones, gives you osteoporosis, ulcerate your intestines, inflame your intestines, put fat on your belly in a way that promotes heart disease, make you depressed, and create all kinds of other problems in the body, including, as I said, suppressing the immune system. So chronic stress is a major threat to health. Now, in 2008, in Greece, there was an economic crisis, and which I don't have to tell this audience about.
Yes.
And they did a study comparing the moods and the stress levels of British young people and Greek students. And they found that the Greek students were more depressed and more anxious, and they had abnormal stress hormone levels, which the researchers said makes them more prone to physiological illness. In other words, the social factors that in Greece at that time were creating emotional stress for people were also undermining their physical health. So it's that simple. Simple. Why physicians don't get it? I mean, this is what's so weird about it, is that the science is clear, demonstrated, thousands of studies. And what I'm talking about, nobody talks about in the medical schools. So that means that if you have rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or depression or ulcerative colitis or fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue, very often, or malignancy, and if you go to their doctor, they'll look after your body, and they can do wonderful things. Physicians, I know this, being a doctor myself, but they'll never ask you about childhood trauma that have made you live a stressed life. They'll never ask you about how you feel about yourself as a human being. What is your relationship like with your partners and your friends and your spouse? How do you feel about your job? How do you feel about
which
yourself?
environment you grew up, or
That's
what's
right.
happening now in your world?
That's right. And what's happening in your emotional world. And yet, these factors have everything to do with your illness. And actually, if you can work on the emotional factors, that can also affect your disease in a positive sense. So these are important questions.
You write on your book that a lot of people, while their body is showing the first symptoms of a disease, they do not take any action of examination or prevention because they believe that it's just stress, that it will go away, and often resulting in the onset of physical illnesses. Why have we not learned to listen to our bodies, but rather listen to our minds, telling us that it is just stress and it will go away?
Well, first of all, because we think that stress is just an emotional thing, but it isn't. It's a physical. But why we haven't learned to listen to our bodies is a very important question. That has to do with what happens in childhood. So you've never met a one-day-old baby who doesn't listen to his body. newborns are totally connected to their bodies. Something happens. And that something occurs during childhood, when the parents in our society don't know how to listen to the child's emotions, or the child is unhappy or suffering. Well, let's take an extreme example. But it happens a lot. Let's say a child is being abused. If you're a 3-year-old and your parent is hitting you, and your parent loves you, they're trying to do their best. I'm not blaming the parents, but they're hitting you. You know, I've read a few novels by Nikos Kazantzakis, so I know a little bit about, you know, I know that took place a long time ago, a century ago or more, but, you know, so kids were beaten, right? They were spanked, they were hit. No. Or let's say a child is being sexually abused, which also happens in every country. So if you're 3 years old and you're being hit, your stress response, I mean, if I was in the same room with you and I started hitting you, you'd have a stress response and you want to fight or you want to run away. But what if you're 3 years old and you're being hit and you want to fight or you want to run away? Can you? As a 3-year-old, you can't fight back or run away. What does the child do? They disconnect from their body because it's too painful to be in it. Because they can't fight or run away, they have to run away somehow. You know how they run away? They disconnect their bodies. They stop feeling their bodies. A lot of people in this society disconnect from their bodies because it was, and even if you're not hit, you just have painful emotions. And when a child has painful emotions, that happens in life. But that needs to be seen and heard and listened to and held by the adults. A lot of adults don't know how to do that. They'll tell the kid, oh, don't worry about it, or don't be such a sissy, or what's the big deal? Cheer up. Well, what does the child do? It's too painful to stay with their painful emotions. They disconnect from their emotions. So many of us,
like a kind of protection for them.
That's exactly what it is. It's a protection. So a lot of us in this society, we grow up disconnected from ourselves. So when later on our body sends us messages, we don't pay attention because we've been programmed not to. And then very often I find that a disease comes along and the disease wakes people up and forces them to pay attention. Now, I don't recommend that way of learning. And sometimes it's too late. Yeah.
We must learn from a disease.
Yeah. But I've also met a lot of people who did learn from the disease and it changed their lives, you know. But again, I don't recommend it. I'm just saying it happens, and it's a result of that disconnection that occurred early in life.
From your clinical experience, which are the most important physical illnesses that could potentially be prevented if we took better care of our mental health?
Autoimmune disease, where the immune system attacks the body itself. This typically happens to people who are very nice and they suppress their healthy anger. They don't look after their own emotional needs, and they're afraid of disappointing other people. And the more trauma there is, the more autoimmune disease there is. So, for example, in Canada, we have our Aboriginal indigenous population called Indians. Well, they're not Indians. They're Canadian Aboriginal people. Before colonization, they used to have no autoimmune disease at all. No rheumatoid arthritis, for example. Now, today, an Indigenous woman in Canada has 6 times the risk of rheumatoid arthritis than somebody else. 6 times. And it's purely because of trauma. And because they're Indigenous and they're suppressed and oppressed, and they have to suppress their emotions, and because they're women, the rate of rheumatoid arthritis is 6 times greater than the average. That's totally preventable. It's completely preventable. A lot of malignancies happen to people who suppress their anger. When you suppress your anger, and it's not your fault, because if you again, have you ever met a 2-day-old baby that suppresses their anger? If they're upset about something, a 2-day-old baby, oh, I shouldn't express it. Never happens. But something happens in childhood that gives the child the message that their anger is not acceptable. In order to belong and to be loved, they repress, push down their anger. Now, because the mind and the body are not separable, and because the immune system and the emotional system are part of the same system, when you're suppressing your emotions, you're also suppressing your immune system, which means that you're more likely to get malignancy. And by the way, it's very interesting. Like, what is healthy anger? Now, again, to come back to you and I, if I were to attack you or insult you, you should get angry with me. Stop it, Gabor. You can't talk to me that way. That would be a healthy boundary defense. So the job of healthy anger is to protect your boundaries. Now, what is the job of the immune system? It's the same thing. It's to protect your boundaries, to let in what is healthy and nourishing, and to keep out like healthy bacteria or vitamins or nutriments, but keep out dangerous viruses, keep out toxins, destroy malignant cells. So the emotional system and the immune system have exactly the same role, a boundary defense. Now, they're not separate systems. Scientifically speaking, they're all part of the same system. So when you're repressing your emotions, guess what? You're also inhibiting your immune system. It's really that simple. So a lot of diseases that have to do with the immune system, autoimmune disease, when the immune system attacks the body, or when the immune system fails to protect you from infection or from malignancy, these are very often have to do with the emotional factors.
This is something not everybody knows, that suppressing our emotions affects our immune system. And I think that in our society it is considered also some kind of weakness if we express our feelings.
Exactly.
Why do you think we find it difficult to cope with our feelings?
Well, when children are born, they have needs. And one of the needs that children for healthy development have is to be able to experience all their emotions. Now, we're born wired in our brains with certain emotions. Not just we are, all mammals are, dogs and cats and whales and lions and bears. And so we share the same emotional systems with all mammals. For joy, for playfulness, for curiosity, for fear, for panic, for anger, for love. In a healthy environment, a child can have these emotions and the parents can handle them and receive them and validate them. Now, however, when the parents can't handle the child's anger and they punish it, or they say, if you're going to be angry, you have to be by yourself, child gets the message, I can be loved or I can be angry, but I can't be both at the same time. Now, I need to be loved because without that, I can't survive. So I'm going to push down my anger. Or the parents might be unhappy and the child is very playful and joyful, and the parents say, be quiet. The child learns, I can be joyful and express my vitality, or I can be loved, but I can't be both at the same time. So we become afraid of our own emotions because our emotions threaten the relationship on which we depend on. this suppression or separation from emotions is a coping mechanism, but unfortunately, it becomes part of our personality, and then we don't know how to be any other way. You know, in my new book, which I know is also going to be published in Greece, it's called The Myth of Normal, Illness and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And I do talk about this as trauma, just as you say. That trauma isn't just when they hate you or they hurt you. Trauma is also when your needs are not met, when emotionally you're suppressed. That's a trauma. That's a wound. And it becomes unconscious. And that's why, as a psychologist, you know very well that a big part of your job is to make the unconscious conscious.
Exactly.
So that people can have a choice about it. As long as it's unconscious, we're like puppets on a string pulled by our unconscious. Like Pinocchio, we're just foolish little puppets, you know.
One final question. What do you hope Greek readers will gain from reading your book?
I don't know that I can say anything special about Greek people, but I will say what I hope people learn how to say no. When there's enough that wants to be said. Because here's the thing, I phone you up and I say, hey, can we have coffee? Okay. But let's say you're up all night helping a friend or working, and you're tired and you don't feel like having coffee and you don't feel like coming. You feel like going to bed, but you're afraid to disappoint me because you're such a nice guy. So you don't say no and you come and have coffee with me. What's going to be impact on you? What's going to be the impact? You're going to be tired. You're going to be stressed. Okay. So
maybe angry.
And you'd be, yeah, even resentful. Yes. Yeah, that's right. And so what I'm saying is, when there's a no that wants to be said, I hope that people will say it. Whether it's on the job or in their relationships with their spouse or their friends, learn how to say no. Don't be afraid of saying no. That's my big hope. That'll help to protect your health. Now, that's a simple wish. The larger wish is that people would understand that the human body and the human soul and the human mind, you can't separate them. All one, and we have to honor the unity. That's my big hope.